Hello, my name is Lloyd and welcome to this journey through the book of Acts, the story of the early church, God's church. And we are in the middle of Stephen's speech. He has been accused by the religious leaders of his day of undermining Moses, of talking about the destruction of the temple. And Stephen makes a very long speech. And we're in the middle of it right now. And today we're going to be looking at Moses, where Stephen talks about Moses, and we see a man far from undermining Moses, but actually honouring of Moses and his life. And we had heard of how God had called Abraham in the previous couple of weeks and made him the focus of a new people, God's special people, his covenantal people through all the ages of the earth. Those who God's affection, his devotion, his love, his promises were fastened onto. And despite all their turning against him and their attempts to reject God, God decides to own this people, gives them gracious promises, and he fulfills them. We looked also at how God used Joseph, despite his rejection by his brothers, a point that Stephen hints at, that the religious leaders of his day were guilty of regarding Stephen himself. And similarly, in Jesus' life, how the religious leaders of that day rejected Jesus, the Messiah. So let's read in Acts chapter 7, in the middle of Stephen's speech, looking at verses 17 to 29, the first 40 years of Moses' life. But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. And he dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. At this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were quarrelling and tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?" But the man who was wronging his neighbour thrust him aside, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" At this retort Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. So this week we begin to look at the longest section of Stephen's speech, which covers this pivotal individual, Moses, who is associated often with the law. God spoke to him and gave him the law, which he presented to the people at Mount Sinai. And through it all we see how, in fact, the religious leaders are the blasphemers, those who reject God, not Stephen, in the way that he speaks in such an honouring way about Moses and his life. Stephen will highlight how all the interactions so far in the historical narrative and account that he has told occur outside the temple, some in foreign nations, foreign lands, and that all these moments, the temple, in terms of the building, did not even exist yet. So that the true dwelling place of God was actually the place where God chose to dwell amongst his people. And that is the place of interest that God shows as important in this narrative. And this was something that Solomon repeated when he dedicated the temple. He said, the temple cannot contain God. In fact, it was the ancestors of these religious leaders who were persecuting and constantly rejecting God, and his servants, including on multiple occasions Moses. Moses was opposed by the people of God in his time, just as Stephen is being opposed by the religious leaders. And Moses was a type of Christ, who the builders rejected, and on whom God would make the cornerstone of his plans, this Jesus. So Moses is like a type of Jesus that God would choose to use in his time, even though he was rejected. And as the years rolled by, Moses became this cornerstone of God's plan to bring his people out of captivity, in a foretaste of what God would do through Jesus, taking his people out of sin. So let's hear more, starting off with the time of promise drawing near, which God had granted to Abraham. So the people begin to increase and multiply in Egypt until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. So all the promises God made to Abraham about his offspring and the land that they would inhabit were fulfilled through Moses 400 years later. God is so faithful to his promises. And this is the Moses who Stephen has been accused of speaking against. An accusation which we all see holds no water whatsoever. We're left in no doubt that Stephen actually highly honors and respects Moses, and it rather is the religious leaders who are disrespectful and dishonoring of Moses, like their ancestors who repeatedly rejected Moses and the God of Moses. So the first promise made by God to Abraham is fulfilled. His descendants are multiplied wonderfully, until the point when the rulers of Egypt begin to oppress them because they have become so mighty in the land. And as always, when the church is oppressed, she grows and multiplies. After many centuries, has God forgotten his promise to Abraham? Do you feel like, if you're in the West, that the church is decreasing and diminished in power and influence? Absolutely not. God is working, his promises are being fulfilled. And in the case of Egypt, Moses is to be born and he's to be a deliverer at the worst possible moment as the persecution of the Israelites intensifies. And it is important that God said to Moses that there would be an enslavement of his people for 400 years, because God is never surprised. God is always aware of everything that's going on. God is sovereign over all things. So the suffering of his people was no surprise to God. And actually, the promise that God had made to deliver his people is fulfilled in Moses. And this paints a picture of the eternal redemption from sin that Jesus would bring. So God is using his people in Egypt and their captivity to paint the picture of a future redemption, a permanent redemption, not just a temporary redemption. The nation forgot all the good that Joseph had done. The nation of Egypt forgot all the good that Joseph had done 400 years earlier. How he had saved the nation from the greatest trial in their recent history, a global famine. And God had instead made Egypt the breadbasket to the entire known world at the time, including Joseph's own family who had rejected him. So what sort of persecution were the Israelites subjected to? And what does this mean for the persecution that Stephen is facing as he delivers the speech? It says, Pharaoh dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so they would not be kept alive. Once again, there's this tone of our fathers, our race. So Stephen is once again impressing on the religious leaders, this is our stories, our promises, this is God dealing with our people. And he's drawing them back into the history of the nation of Israel, God's covenant people, to try and help them see that they are on the wrong side of history. They are opposing God. The Israelites were told to kill their own children to try and reduce their influence, their population. And this is a barbaric crime that was committed against the people of Israel in the land of Egypt. One comparable maybe to the horror of the killing of the unborn in our time, which is a great stain and sin. The Egyptians thought that by oppressing the Israelites that they would be safer and save themselves. But in fact, it was the exact opposite. They instead began to store up the wrath of God against them and against their unrighteousness. And the judgments that would then come upon them would be as a result of their persecution of God's people. And persecution is the most evil and foolish tool of wicked governments against their own people. For when they persecute the people of God and the people of their nation, they are in effect playing chicken with God, with Almighty God, who will overpower them in the end. And that's what we see happening when Egypt gets deprived of their slave community, the Israelites, and God acts on their behalf. It says at this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. When he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. So Moses was born at the worst possible moment, the time of the greatest persecution of the Israelites. It was similar for Jesus. He was wanted by Herod at his birth, and who ironically fled to Egypt to hide. And now we have the people of God in Egypt wanting to escape from Egypt, and God as their deliverer. And we may think that Moses was abandoned by his parents, but if we read the account in Exodus, it tells us that Miriam waited and watched, and Moses was never abandoned. He was always in the eyesight of his family. They always had their eyes on him. So he was safe throughout this exposure. Moses' parents had very little time with him as a child to influence his behavior, to impress on him the promises of God and the purpose of God, before he was handed over or adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Yet whatever they did do, it was enough to last him a lifetime and cause him to know God and choose God's promises over being an Egyptian. And he chose to side with the people of Israel, despite all the trappings of being an Egyptian in the land of Egypt. And we often despair of our parenting. We need to remember to trust God and his handiwork in the family unit and parenthood. And if we will obey him and bring up our kids as best we can in the way of the Lord, that they will keep in the way of it throughout their lives. So wonderfully and ironically, Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses. And so Moses is effectively Pharaoh's son and in line to the throne, some have said, some commentators. So Pharaoh pays for the deliverer to be raised for the people of Israel who he is oppressing. He pays the nursery fees, he pays for the upbringing of Moses, and his own daughter raises the deliverer before his own eyes. Isn't God a master of surprise? His tactics are so wonderful. And he who sits in the heavens laughs. That's what Psalms 2 says. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So Moses learned how to live in the greatest kingdom on earth at the time, how to excel, how to succeed. Yet all the while, he held true to the people of promise, the slave community from which he was drawn. We will see how later, when God calls him to service, how he says he can't speak well. He was trained to speak, we've just seen. He was mighty in word and deed. He knew all about the Egyptian world system. He was full of training from the Egyptian ways. He was full of promise from a worldly point of view. If he had stayed on course, he might have done well as an Egyptian. He would have been a great prince of Egypt. The world was his oyster. He was well connected, well educated, able to throw his weight around and pull strings, including from his adopted father, Pharaoh. But as we shall see, none of this worldly training was of use to teaching him how to lead the people of God. And Moses had to effectively unlearn a lot of what he spent his first 40 years being trained up in and learning. And next week we will hear how Moses takes things into his own hands and things fall apart. Moses gets ahead of God and acts with human wisdom, human endeavor, human strength. Yet, at heart, he is feeling his way towards God's calling on his life to deliver his people. and to bring them out to be a worshipping community, to be with God. Yet his initial attempt was of a human, self-appointed feel. He was having a go rather than being one sent of God. And when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He kills him. And this has all the hallmarks of one who takes his own initiative instead of one who depends on God, who's sent by God. It feels like success. It looks like success. He's killed an Egyptian who's been wronging the Israelites. He has brought justice, or so it looks or seems so. Yet it has all about it an earthly feel, a striving feel. Despite being rooted in the purposes of God, Moses seems to strike out on his own. And although we will see ultimately that Moses will be brought about by God to deliver his people, at this point in time, it's very earthy, very human focused on the strength and might of Moses himself. So how did it get into the heart of Moses to do this? To identify with the slave community over the Egyptians that he had been brought up amongst. It could have only come from God, such a constant urging in the back of his mind to identify with the people of God. And whatever he tried to do in this moment, it seems to end in a terrible failure. But let's not be too hard on Moses, for it is his fellow Israelites who behaved the worst about the call of God on Moses' life. They act out of jealousy instead of seeing God's hand in it. And they must wait now a further 40 years to be delivered as Moses is taken away into the desert to become a dad. And all of that leadership and all those skills he'd learned in Egypt need to be drained away and needs to be prepared instead to lead God's people. And needs to become a man after God's own heart, one who has known what it means to obey God and who becomes the most humble man on earth. And it says that Moses supposed that his brothers would understand that he was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. So he made a supposition there. And as they were quarrelling, he tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers, why do you wrong each other?" But the man who was wronging his neighbour thrust him aside. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" At this report, Moses flees and he becomes an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. He supposed the sign of one who does not spend time with in God's presence. That's when we start supposing things for God and presume what God wants, and we complete God's sentences, fills in the gaps, takes initiative when it looks like God is acting too slowly. He seems to help God out when God is apparently unable. That's what Moses did. Yes, he's a little bit adolescent, but underneath this all, like Joseph, there was a firm calling from God that needed to be worked out, not with human endeavour and strength, but by God's great power at work in his humbled life 40 years later. So things go from wonderful, Moses sensing the call of God in his life, to abysmal in one day. Yesterday he felt that the revolution had started. Today he sees that his own people are rejecting him, and the call of God in his life seems to be over, and he flees. And this is often how a worldly church, like that which Stephen is addressing in the speech, reacts to a move of God. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? And sometimes because you have the Spirit of God amongst you as a Bible-believing evangelical church, that you're different to the rest of the church. And the church will look back and say, who are you to judge us? Who are you to say that you have God's presence, you have the Spirit? By saying that, you say that we don't. Why would God call you and not us? Many times the worldly church opposes God's work and must pay with a deadly delay. Here we see 40 years of waiting is imposed on God's people. They did not understand the purposes of God. They were so jealous of Moses, maybe because of his privileged upbringing, that they lost sight of God's deliverance, God's purposes for them as a people. The Exodus is not just about justice, as we'll see. It is primarily about God redeeming his people to himself, a foreshadowing of the great and permanent redemption from sin, which separates us from God at the cross by Jesus. So when people don't understand God's purposes, they reject those that he's called, as the Israelites did to Moses, and as the religious leaders did of Jesus, and now of Stephen. They chose rather to be slaves to Egyptian taskmasters than be delivered by God's humble servant Moses, who's attempting to begin to clarify his call. So with stumbling steps, he's killed someone and it all goes wrong, but they could have recognized that this was God's hand. Who knows if these arguing men had not now listened to Moses in this moment, how different things would have been. Maybe they would have gone to the promised land straight away instead of having to wait 80 years, because it'd be 40 years and then another 40 years in the desert. Instead, Moses is given dad duties, and he's made into a father, a dad, to learn how to lead God's people, because he needs the patience of a loving father, something he lacks, as is seen from his treatment in this situation where he just wants to kill people. He acts out of impulse. So, are you jealous of those who God has appointed to his work? Are you like the Israelites, those who did not understand God's call and rejected Moses and God through Moses? Are you like Moses, aware of the calling on God in your life, but hopeless in the delivery, supposing instead of getting before God and getting clarity in the calling? Are you excelling in human effort and human strength, but wanting in God's given authority and his sending of you? Do you not even know the God who sends and calls us, the God who saves and fights for his own people, who designed us to be worshippers like the people of Israel, who he had redeemed from Egypt to go and worship in the desert? Would you come to Jesus there? Would you repent of your sin and come to Jesus, who will forgive you and give you a new life? You will be born again into the family of God.